So we have a project right now in Fulton Market that we are out in the market to finance. We are financing both the equity and the debt. In round numbers, it's a $250 million project. What's understood about that when they get to be this big is you're definitely using institutional capital. What we've seen with the capital markets in disarray for the last 2 years is we have not seen a lot of new construction. What we've seen in Chicago is very good rent growth because there has not been development. A deal is only as good as its ability to get financed. It doesn't matter how great the deal is if capital doesn't believe in the submarket. And so I'm very happy to say that capital is now finding its way back to Chicago.
Welcome to another episode of the Straight Up Chicago Investor Podcast. I'm Tom Shellcross. With me, as always, is Mark Ainley. Mark, how you doing?
Not bad, man. Today's episode, it made me think of one thing: how much little stuff happens in the city that we don't appreciate. And I say it from the context of, you got things like Chicago Marathon. You talk about the music venues, but just having that many music venues and that many people that come here to play here. You talk about things like Lollapalooza. You have all these different things that in NASCAR, like that us as locals are probably more annoyed by than appreciate.
Oh,
The general population is annoyed when Lollapalooza comes down every year. And that's what makes this city have the access to the things and why people want to be here. And, we talk so much about what makes the city great. And sometimes we just kind of skip all those small things that we take for granted. Because in Tulsa, Oklahoma, they don't have that. They don't have in Kansas City, Missouri, Lollapalooza. They don't have all those big venues that we have here. And I guess we talk about in the show too, to appreciate this city, visiting other cities. And I think that was a huge point that we talked about today.
Yeah, I'll go even smaller. Like, do you know how many street fests I go to in the summer? Like with the kids, do you know how many block parties I go to? Like this, like that doesn't exist like in a lot of other places. Or they have like a street fest where every weekend in the summer there's 5 different ones you can just wander into.
Yeah. And then you even go even more granular, all the stuff that maybe some of us don't even notice, all the different artwork and all these different in the parks. There's so much art around the city that you stop and you read that plaque that's about a paragraph long, like that. There's a lot of people that really value that sometimes we just walk by.
Well, have you even been to, like, you probably have, but like how many Chicagoans have been to 50 of the 70 plus neighborhoods?
Yeah.
Right. Like, I literally, I probably didn't go. It was right before COVID, the first time I ever went to Pilsen. Right. And it's freaking awesome down there. I grew up here my whole life and didn't even know it existed.
Well, think about the museums. You hear so many people say, yeah, I haven't been to the Science Museum for 12 years. But it's like people come to the city just to go to that museum. Like,
yes.
You've done the Chicago Facts about all the different museums. Like, people don't, like, this is a museum hub. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah, we're spoiled. Stop being spoiled. Appreciate this beautiful city.
Yeah. Sorry, I got so like excited and built up passion during the episode of how much we take for granted, and that's those little things that sometimes even annoy us are actually the things that make the city so great.
Yeah. No, our guest today was awesome. We'll get into it, but man, like so she was on a panel for Biz Now. We kind of just cold called, and when you get a response, I think you never know how it's going to be, and she was just fantastic, just absolutely phenomenal, and just not just in what she's accomplished, but just in her view on the city. And it got me fired up.
It breaks down, man. The way we broke down those timelines on this episode is crazy of what it really takes to build a $250 million project.
Yeah. Also, we had a ton of name drops from past guests that we didn't realize all the connections.
Yeah, I love that too. How it comes full circle with Lee and then Sierra. Like, that was great. We should maybe even reach out
Mark
to
Rutson too.
Yeah, Mark Ronson. Maybe even reach out to have Sierra back on. That might be a good repeat guest.
It's been almost 4 years. So, all right, we'll stop teasing the listeners. So let's jump into it. What's our housing provider tip of the week?
All right. So right now it's fall. You probably hear this in December. Or it's winter even, and exterior work they're gonna have to do next year. That parking lot, the sidewalks. Get that stuff all negotiated right now. I'm pretty sure I've used this as a Chicago or a landlord tip in the past, but this is huge for your numbers next year. You can negotiate if prices go up. A good chance prices aren't going to go down between now and springtime for asphalt. If anything, it'll probably go up due to the demand in the beginning of the season. So lock all that stuff in right now. And now it's the time to build rapport with your vendors as well too, because they actually have time to stop and listen, or they have time to stop by your office and go through things with you. So take advantage of this, what should be a slower season for you, which is definitely a slower season for your exterior vendors, and ultimately save you money and help you build a relationship.
Love it. All right. Today's guest, 30 plus years experience, just a insane resume here. Her projects total over $3.5 billion in revenue with a B. Developed and sold over 12,000 residential units, 2,500 hotel rooms, 2 million square feet of retail. Successfully exited or sold off her brokerage to Cushman Wakefield. Had a successful exit with Anodo. We had the Mark Rutson reference earlier from episode 274. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Susan Tjarksen, welcome to the show.
It's my pleasure to be here this morning.
Yeah, so you we connected you were on the panel of Biz Now, so it's not just us that think that you are important. You're an important person here in Chicago.
I'll take the compliment today. I'm not sure that's the case, but I've been doing this for a while.
Yeah, so let's dive in there. So I'm sure in the intro I'll talk about you're also a fellow Illini, which is one of the reasons we were attracted to you. But you've had over 30 years experience here. You've done a ton. How did it all get started? Like, how did you fall into real estate?
So I fell into real estate without going into minutia. I fell into it completely by accident. I went to the University of Illinois. I graduated with a finance degree. I then went to London to do my master's work as a Rotary International Fellow in International Economics, which was a fancy way of saying a lot more math than I'd planned for. I came home and it was a recession, and started working in Chicago, and the only job I could find was as a night manager at the Orrington Hotel in Evanston, Illinois. So for $5 an hour, I worked from 11 at night till 7 in the morning. And I remember they promoted me and offered me a quarter. So I went from $5 to $5.25. And I said I would take it if I didn't have to wear their polyester uniform, if I could still wear my own clothes. And they said yes.
An early negotiator.
That's it. My roommate was my sister, whom I'm very close to. She got married, and I needed to find a place to live. So I started looking for a job, and this hotel job popped up with on-site living in the hotel. And I took it for no other reason other than I needed a place to live. So I moved downtown. I started working at the Talbot Hotel. It was a dream job. It was a pleasure to get up and go to work every day. What I realized was they were renovating the hotel, and I liked the real estate renovation much more than the hotel management part of it. And from there, I moved from job to job in commercial real estate. I ended up during the Great Recession doing 167 receiverships. And from that, I started my own brokerage company, which then got purchased. I sold it to Cushman Wakefield. We started a fintech company called Anodo that we actually successfully exited to Walker and Dunlop, and here I am today.
All right, there's a lot to unpack there. So let's talk about just some of those early days.
What, that I don't like polyester? We need to unpack that.
I also don't like polyester. Let's talk about just, there's got to be some horror stories from the hotel, or just some funny stories, right? Like just being hands-on there, like any good memories or anything funny to share with the listeners from that experience.
So a couple of things. The hotel is at 20 East Delaware, so it was right near the new Bloomingdale's. And Bloomingdale's, as we all know, has a big floor for Santa Claus. And the person they hired to be Santa Claus died at the hotel in the middle of the night in only his striped bikini underwear. So I was the lucky finder of dead Santa Claus.
To this day, you still hate Christmas? Are you okay?
It was you learn a lot. Let me just put it that way about how do you get dead bodies out the back door without being disrespectful. And there was actually a plumbing joke that came to life. There was a fairly large plumber who got stuck underneath the sink, and we had to weld him out. We had to actually cut him out. So
Wow.
that was also interesting. But what was hyper interesting about that experience was I learned how to renovate things in terms of what's the cost benefit analysis, what do you have to do so that the building stays whole, and what do you have to do so that the hotel guest or the client feels like they got their money's worth. And seeing that seesaw balance of that was very integral to the rest of my career.
Man, that's a lot. All right, so you like the value add aspect of this. You like the rehab. When did you start making the move then, right? Because it sounds like we end up doing our own brokerage. Talk to us about that time period of, hey, I'm not going to work for this hotel anymore. You might do similar jobs, but when did you make the move to be more, call it entrepreneur?
So from that job, I worked for several developers in the city of Chicago, and learned a whole bunch about how do you finance these bigger projects. 700 North Michigan was one of them, with Japanese money at the time, was very in vogue in the United States. And so, when you go through the development process, you realize it takes 6 or 7 years by the time you identify a site, you zone a site, you find the financing for a site, you build it, and then you either sell it if it's condominiums or lease it up as rental or stabilize it as a hotel. You realize that life cycle is 6, 7 years. And there's only so much bandwidth you have and able to do more than one or two of those projects at a time. But that was very instrumental in understanding how deals got put together and understanding how real estate works from the sticks and bricks and money standpoint. And after, or during the Great Recession, obviously development came to a grinding halt, and there were all of these broken products or broken buildings that were half finished or not quite finished or not quite started, that banks were like, we need some help. Which ones of these are worth finishing? Which ones aren't? How do we save as much money on them as possible? So it was really a great segue to use all of my development experience into figuring out how do loans work and how do you finish buildings as economically as possible.
We all know working with the city has its unique challenges, this city specifically. What are some insights as far as, putting up these type of buildings, dealing with whether it be the alderman or the city or the permits or the building department? Like, that's a whole other beast that a lot of our listeners do aspire to be.
So I have found very good people who work at the city, and I have found people who definitely understand what has to happen in order to get a city building built. I think that they are as frustrated by the red tape as anybody else, or the lack of the left hand knowing what the right hand is doing. These community processes are brutal, and everybody should have a say, hence it's a democracy, which yesterday proved, among other things. Everybody should definitely have a say. However, that, in these very specific cases of building buildings, I don't think people understand the long-term goal of how adding residential housing to the city of Chicago helps everybody. It helps by having more supply. It helps by, in the long run, in bringing pricing down, rental rates down. And I think that this process becomes so cumbersome in the city of Chicago that unfortunately people have started to look at other cities for development. And I will say a bright, shiny moment is Sierra Boatwright. She is doing a great job and is probably the best appointment I've seen in the last 10 years.
Oh, Mark, can you find Sierra's? I think she was like episode 29 with us. She was an OG. She was one of our first 50 episodes. We had her on talking about Pullman.
She's great. She's great. And her mantra is, how do we get to yes instead of no, that can't be done, or we're not doing it that way. And I think that is what has to happen at a planning and zoning and permitting level in order for the city of Chicago to continue to thrive. Whether you're building a 4-flat, renovating an 8-flat, or building a $200 million building, it's how do we get to yes.
Yeah, she was episode 29. That was a long time ago.
There you go.
Yeah, we probably.
What is today's episode?
We're like 340s or something. That's like 4 years ago.
Wow. There you go.
I remember the name though, right? Like that was
Yep.
she was
Yep.
good. So
She's
She's great.
talking about one of my favorite spots, Pullman. Um,
I agree. And these historic neighborhoods are important to Chicago. They're important to the heritage, and they're also important for the ability to make decisions on where you want to live in the city by having viable neighborhoods everywhere.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Let's talk about receivership, right? It's still around today, but back then it had to be, just lots of opportunity if you are on that end of it. So, can you just, for someone who's never even heard the term, explain the process and give us kind of the day to day what you were responsible for? Why would someone want to be a receiver? What are the benefits to doing that? And why is the bank hiring you?
I'm not sure anybody in the right mind wants to be a receiver, but it is a business line. So if a loan gets in trouble, a bank has to put it on a watch list. Once it's on a watch list, at a certain point in that arc, that means that a receiver is appointed to maintain the asset so that the borrower isn't the one making the decisions on the asset and the lender is not the one making decisions on the asset. A third party who's in theory neutral is making decisions on the asset, and the receiver is appointed by a court. So a lender goes to court and says, look, my loan is in default. The borrower can't make restitution or keep it whole. In the interim, I want to make sure that the safety of the asset is secured. I am asking the court to appoint a receiver. And we were receivers for 4 flats all the way up to office buildings, hotels, and large apartment and condominium complexes. And in those receiverships, you do everything from collect rent to decide whether buildings should be painted to answering security alarms that go off at 2 a.m. in the morning. So there's not a lot of things that are glamorous about a receivership. And I would say at least 50% of the time, the borrower is doing everything they can to make your life as a receiver not go very well because they're mad that they've lost control of their asset. And the lender is very clear about what a lender can do without interference and can only go so far. And so sometimes it gets very contentious in the middle. At the end of a receivership, 2 things can happen. Either the borrower makes restitution or the court orders a sale. And then as a receiver, you are in charge of selling the asset in the open market. You don't have to be a broker, by the way, to be a receiver. A court-appointed receiver can, without a broker's license, sell real estate on behalf of the court.
Never knew that.
Yes, and that sounds a little counterintuitive, but a lot of receivers are also attorneys. And a lot of attorneys are also brokers. So, it helps clear the market and get assets that are stuck in kind of no man's land of they're not performing, and the borrower doesn't have a pathway to performing. So selling these things typically is at a discount. And while that's not great for anybody, it does provide liquidity in a marketplace, and liquidity is what a marketplace is built on. Without liquidity, without buying and selling, there isn't any really establishment of pricing or of what happens next with an asset.
I know the tougher part of being a receiver is actually having the right clientele or having clientele, period. Is there any licensing requirement then at all at that point?
There, I don't now this was 10 years ago. I don't know if the laws have changed at least 10 years ago. But at that time, you acted as a property manager. You could hire a property manager, you could hire an asset manager, or you could do it yourself.
Now, I know a lot of people, I know not a lot of people, there's not a lot of them out there, but I know a handful of receivers that they like to see they see this deal flow early on and either the brokers and they can get the brokerage deal out of it, or
Right.
potentially they could put together a deal to present to the bank if it's going to follow through. Was there opportunities that you're able to create around that for yourself while you're doing that?
So I would just say that receivers serve a purpose, and you end up selling most of the stuff that's out there because the bank does not want to take it back. Is it self-serving? Maybe a little bit, but for the most part, you're a third party intermediary as a receiver. You're not the beneficiary of some big deal. In fact, that's a conflict of interest. If you're the receiver to actually buy it, the court does not look happily upon that.
Got it. Makes sense. All right. So coming out of this, is this where the brokerage takes off for you? Is through this receiver?
Yes.
Like, let's talk about that, because selling your brokerage to Cushman Wakefield, that's a big deal. So like, you guys definitely got to a substantial number here. So talk about just starting that, growing that, because we have a lot of brokers listening on the show and they're like, well, that sounds awesome. I would love to do that.
So coming out of those receiverships, I had a lot of lending clients, and they said, Susan, you're really good at this. You should really be a broker. And I said, I'm only interested in being a broker if I can start my own company, because it was important to me that brokerage was on my terms. And what do I mean by on my terms? It means that we're going to be honest and transparent. It means we're going to use data. And it meant that I'm going to tell you the truth, whether you want to hear it or not, as opposed to some tinkering around the edges of what reality is. And so I was in a position to be able to start a brokerage firm. The first person I hired was a data scientist with a degree from the University of Chicago. That doesn't seem so out in the middle of la la land today, but 9 years ago, that was a big deal. And that was a quarter of our annual budget, that salary.
Wow.
And I realized
so that's a commitment, right? I don't want to cut you off, but that is a commitment.
Yes. And my partner was Lee Kaiser, and I think very highly of him. And we thought there was a better way forward with brokerage, particularly in the institutional space. And what we realized is people don't need more data. They need it interpreted in a way that helps them make better decisions faster. And hence we hired this computer scientist. And that turned into something that was an identity for our brokerage firm. It was certainly on the leading edge of where brokerage is today. And I think that was part of what was so appealing to Cushman and Wakefield. I will also say that we were, for a brokerage company, an institutional brokerage company, we were very diverse. It was owned by a woman. We had plenty of LGBTQ members on our team. We had Hispanics on our team. We had Asians. We had 50% of our team was women. So it was important to me that this looked like how society looked and acted, and not be a 65-year-old white guy's world.
You go to a real estate meetup, like, unfortunately, that's 80%. Like, it's a huge chunk, right? So it's got to be colorful, and it's got to be appealing for Cushman and Wakefield to say, like, oh, this makes sense. This is a reflection of Chicago.
And I don't have anything against 65-year-old white guys, but I am saying that real estate is better when we have several voices from several different backgrounds at the table. And that takes representation and opportunity. And that's hyper important to me.
Especially when you talk about how important diverse communities are. And
right.
And
exactly.
Preserving them.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you mentioned Lee. I'm kind of so you have an impressive resume, but it wasn't explicitly stated on there. I'm kind of putting it all together. The Endoto, was that Mark Rutson then?
Yes. So we hired Mark Rutson.
I'm connecting the dots here of all our guests.
He ended up being CEO of Endoto. And Mark is a beautiful mind. Besides a beautiful person, Mark is a beautiful mind. And that whole thing started with us complaining about CoStar, and there's got to be a better way than them calling brokers asking for in-place cap rates and NOI. And over the course of a weekend, Mark said, "You mean like this?" And 18 months later, it grew into something real. And I'm very disappointed Cushman Wakefield couldn't see the opportunity. I'm very glad that Walker and Dunlop did.
Yeah. For those who want to hear the full story, we won't dive into the whole story of Endoto, but episode 274. We had Mark on. Yeah, we had Mark on about a year ago. He went through everything and
with Hello Data.
Yep.
He's now started another company. He and Tim and other people who are at Endoto, and I can't speak highly enough about them. Great minds.
Yeah, well, they have the ringing endorsement from Lee Kaiser, who friend of the podcast here. So
great.
Usually Lee says it's good. We're listening.
That's good advice. If Lee says it's good, it's probably good.
There's so many people are going to go buy an overpriced Kaiser building now. We got to be careful what we say. All right. So talk about just getting absorbed then into Cushman and Wakefield, right? And I know like it's probably great but like when you actually get absorbed, there's got to be some learning points there, right? There's got to be some like friction. There's got to be like, hey, this is not the way we're used to doing things. Like talk to us about that. Just the pain's probably too strong of a word, but just that actual transition, your reality changes.
Reality does change. I would say it was 92% for the better and 8% for, I've not looked at life that way. We're going to have to figure that out. The 92% that was better, and why Cushman Wakefield was so important, is because it was all asset classes that was important: office, industrial, retail, multifamily, hotels. That was hyper important. That's one thing Cushman Wakefield offered. The second thing was it's an international company, 51,000 people, 451 offices across the globe. That was hyper important. And the third thing was, of all the people, all the groups we looked at, as good as they all were, Cushman Wakefield was the most diverse. And I will say, without meaning to give a shout out, Vicki Noonan was very important to my decision. She runs still the Chicago office. It was very important to me that all of the work that we had done and all the people on her team still continue to have a voice at the table, and she personified that. So Cushman Wakefield was a great fit for us. The 8% that was learning curve were things like how they did expense reports. You have to use their national travel agent in order to book tickets. You had to get some things approved before you spent them. You could only spend so much on a dinner before a deal was closed, or they wouldn't reimburse it. All of that stuff was a learning curve. And I'm not saying it was bad. I was just like, that's interesting. And so that was the entrepreneurial part. But when you think about, you got to multiply that by 51,000 people. Of course, they're going to have, bumpers in the, guardrails up in the bumpers to keep people, let's say, on the right path on a regular basis.
And it stinks. All those things put in place over the time, even just in our company over the 20 years, is all because some idiot did something dumb, and now we have to put a rule in place.
Right, exactly. And I will say, though, it's become more centralized since we joined 6 years ago. We have centers of excellence that are now called hubs, and that's where a lot of graphic design and financial underwriting happens. And those have come light years in the last 3 or 4 years. And I think that there is some strength in that. There's also a learning curve in that you can't look at somebody who sits next to you and say, hey, I don't want to do it that way. I want to do it this way now, particularly at the last second when you're doing a presentation tomorrow. That there's a learning curve that goes in that. But I understand the strength of that as we go through time. And I think that that's a business model that almost everybody on the planet, if they haven't adopted it now, will. That back of house stuff.
Timing is everything, they usually say. And you had a couple of transitions or exits. Like, looking back in hindsight, like, did it make sense? Would you have held out longer for these different scenarios? Maybe let something go a little longer before you moved on. Talk to us about kind of hindsight.
As good as Enoto was, all we had was a good head start. All we had was people new to real estate who didn't have any sacred cows, who were, what if we do it this way? And when we realized we had something, they say to build, you don't build it to sell it, you build it to keep it. And that's how you end up selling it. And we built it to keep it. We realized very quickly that this was going to be a competitive advantage, internal competitive advantage for someone. And certainly Berkadia saw it that way. Walker and Dunlop saw it that way. Cushman Wakefield tried to see it that way. Everybody wants to be a unicorn, but when all you have is a good head start, I think exiting successfully is more important than hanging in there, because that hanging in there adds another 3, 4, 5, 7 years to the exit strategy, and you better be right or you end up getting wiped out.
Or it takes 3, 5, 7 years off your life then.
Yes, with the probability of having nothing to show for it.
Yeah,
one thing I do regret, and it's not anything I think about it, not as much now because time has gone by. I wanted to sell the brokerage and Enoto together because I saw them as integrally locking pieces. And that ended up not happening. And I think that could have made a bigger impact faster in the multifamily space for either Cushman Wakefield or Walker and Dunlop, but that's not the way it unfolded. And, we had outside investors in Enoto, and you have to act as a fiduciary and protect their investment. So, I'm not unhappy with how it happened. If I'd had my druthers, they would have gone to the same place.
That's great.
Got it. Good stuff. All right, so let's talk about some of these bigger developments that you're overseeing right now, right? So we have, to set the table, we have listeners who, they own a 3-unit, then they buy a 10-unit, and then they go buy another one, and that's kind of a lot of our listeners right now. So the idea, they see the cranes in the air, they see these 200-unit developments, they're like, wow, who's doing that? So you maybe pick one of your favorite ones, but we'd love to just kind of take 10 minutes here to walk through like a process front end, like, how long does it take to actually source that? Like, how long are those conversations? And just walk through the process, and we can kind of piggyback some color commentary and questions.
So we have a project right now in Fulton Market that we are out in the market to finance. We are financing both the equity and the debt. In round numbers, it's a $250 million project. For people in real estate, what's understood about that when they get to be this big is you're definitely using institutional capital. The capital stack is typically 60% construction financing, which can be bank debt or debt funds, and 40% of equity. And of that 40%, 10% is provided by the sponsor, meaning the developer, and the 90% is by an institutional or high net worth family office, someone like Facebook family office, someone like Dell family office, someone like Pritzker family office. These big family offices act as institutional capital. They provide the 90%. And what we've seen with the capital markets in disarray for the last 2 years is we have not seen a lot of new construction. And because the returns aren't there, if you can make the returns by buying a building and potentially an existing building at a discount because of their financing situations, why would you take development risk? We are just now seeing that the returns are there for development, particularly in Chicago, because Chicago was so overlooked the last 3 or 4 years with this COVID frenzy to move to warmer climates and move to mountain states with, remote work. Now that we've seen the hybrid work model, if you have to be in the office at least 3 days a week, and I think we're probably going back to 4 days a week, maybe not 5, but I think corporate America is definitely heading into 4 days a week. You can't live in the middle of Idaho anymore and commute to Chicago and have that be a sustained economic model. So, what we've seen in Chicago is very good rent growth because there has not been development. And, that development or that interest in Chicago can be tied back to real estate taxes, can be tied back to this misperception about crime. It can be tied back to a lot of things. When the reality is Chicago is the quality of life in Chicago is very good for the price you pay compared to any other gateway market in the city. And what Chicago has to offer to young professionals with first-time jobs is phenomenal, both for their upward mobility within their workplaces as well as for their social life with the professional sports teams, with NASCAR and Lollapalooza and the marathon and all of this kind of stuff downtown, with all of the entertainment venues. Chicago really is a very vibrant urban downtown. So I've taken that segue before we go back and talk about this deal, because a deal is only as good as its ability to get financed. It doesn't matter how great the deal is if capital doesn't believe in the submarket. And so I'm very happy to say that capital is now finding its way back to Chicago, both to buy standing product and to start to tap the edges for development. Because when we go back to this particular example at $250 million, that's a $90 million equity check. That's not small anywhere in the country. That's not small anywhere on the globe. And so that's a big bet. And we've started to see that these bigger bets are more important to institutional equity sources than smaller bets because they have so much money they're trying to get out. They all were under allocated in 23, in 22 and 23, and we're not able to place as much money as they would have liked to, given market conditions. So now there's all this pent up money looking for places to go. And these bigger deals are now certainly more in vogue than they were in 2023 and the last half of 2022.
Got it. So before moving on, I want to go backwards for a step.
Yeah.
Like finding the land, like how long is this, like years of like speculation of can we do this and waiting for the financing? Like how long has this been like quote unquote on the radar?
So let's just start with, these are basic rules of thumb. You got to look at 10 land pieces to find one that you think is optionable. You have to underwrite 4 of those in order to find one that the numbers work. So that probably takes you 18 months, just that part. Once you find one that you think works, now you've got to spend money hiring an architect, an engineer, start developing plans, you hire a zoning attorney. All of that stuff takes at least 12 months. Now you've got a plan that you think can get through zoning committee. You've got a plan you think you can afford to build. You've had a contractor look at it. You've had a soil engineer tap around the edges to make sure there's no real foundation issues or environmental concerns. And that's hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's not $10,000 or $20,000. It's not unusual to get to final zoning committee for approval and have spent $500,000.
Who's usually putting that money up? Is that the developer? Or are they usually
Yes.
raising that money too as a risk?
So I would say 80% of it is the developer's money. They're taking their own bet. 20% is developers go find a co-GP partner, general partner, who will take the ride with them, and it's their money. But for the most part, this is developers using their own money. And it's borrowing good graces from architects and engineers who are saying, you can pay us over time. We know that it's not income producing or you don't have financing yet. So let's say that's 18 months plus a year. So that's 2.5 years. Then once you get zoning, it's another 4, 5, 6 months till you actually break ground, because you got to pull the permits. You got to find the financing, which takes 6 months. You got to get a final GMP from your contractor. You got to get site readiness. So now we're at year 3 and you haven't broken ground yet. These big buildings are anywhere from 24 to 30 months delivery. So add another 2.5 years. And then it takes a year, at least, these bigger buildings, a year and a half, in order for those to be stabilized. So you're in this thing for 6.5 years before you can even think about exiting it. So these aren't for the faint of heart, and these aren't for people who want to get in and out of a deal in a quick fashion. And some of these deals, that's what you've seen in Chicago, not individual deals per se, even though in these bigger buildings that's the case, but like the 78, Lincoln Yards, Scott Goodman's deal, all of these deals are generational. They're going to go through a lot of boom and bust cycles, economic cycles before they actually reach fruition. And so there's a lot of risk in these deals.
Is the developer even owning the land during this whole process, or is this you got it tied up under contract in the early stages? Of course, during the engineers, soil.
I would say 85% of it is they don't close until they have the zoning and they have financing lined up. 15% are people who have not only the courage of their convictions, but the money to buy it before they know what's going to happen next, or take a bet on zoning.
You're investing all that money and you don't even technically own the land. It's like you can't even justify it for future use, maybe a next generation even. That's crazy.
Right. And so it's high risk, high reward. There's no doubt about that. It's also and that's why developers get frustrated with red tape at the city, is we're trying to provide more units in any city where we know we need housing stock, and you're making our lives harder, not easier. And that's a common refrain across the country. For the most part, there are pockets where people are like welcoming developers with open arms, but in urban environments, where young people continue to flock for jobs and social life and opportunities, we need more housing. And so that's why Sierra is such a breath of fresh air of how do we get to yes? instead of we're going to throw every roadblock in front of you to disencourage you from developing.
Yeah. Going back to just the upfront analysis, what do you do to analyze something like, all right, this is what it's going to be 5 years from now, right? Like you're just, you're putting the finger in the air at that point. Like, what are just some rules of thumb, or just like you're really betting on a lot of macroeconomics there, right? Like it's so foreign to me to think of anything more than a year out.
So you use what's called untrended rents when you do your pro formas. And what that means is you use rents that someone's getting in the marketplace today to determine what you're going to open your building at. And that's the underwriting you do. So what you're betting on is if rent is $4.50 today, that they're underwriting for when you deliver this building 3.5 years from now, you're saying you're going to get at least $4.50. Now, in probability, you're getting more than that, but that's not how these deals get underwritten. So they get underwritten on today's economics. The inflection point that's interesting in today's market is that construction pricing has somewhat stilled, slightly contracted in some parts of the country, but it's because their pipelines are no longer busy because of the disruption in the capital markets and people thinking they can buy standing product for less than it costs to build a new building. And so construction trades are hungry. As soon as cap rates continue to compress again, and in Chicago, they've compressed 50 bips since January 1st. When that compression continues and development becomes more in vogue, we're going to see construction prices start to increase again. Sometime, I would guess, in the third quarter of next year. So today is the opportune time to look at starting new developments, but you can't just start today and say, oh, I want to take advantage of a construction pricing today. Let's go look for dirt, because of what we just talked about. It takes 2.5 or 3 years to get to the point where you can put a shovel in the ground.
Yeah, man, there's got to be a way to, that's so long.
It is not a short amount of time. We joke
I'll have
in
a
the
kid
industry.
in high school by then.
Yes, we joke in the industry. When I started this, I didn't know my husband. I wasn't married. I didn't have kids, and I wasn't worried about preschool or kindergarten. But now I am.
Yeah. So I want to go back to the capital structure. You have a family office in play here. How do they? Is this like a pref return, or you wait? Are they not getting anything until this thing stabilized? Like how far? Like during this time when you are not producing income, are they just sitting on their hands, or are you giving them some sort of return?
No. So they wait for the building to be delivered and to be cash flowing, and for some return, but typically these returns don't happen until you sell a building or recap the building, meaning taking out construction financing, because construction financing is much more expensive than stabilized building financing.
Got it. So they're sitting and patiently waiting as well until liquidity events, just almost like any GP on a normal apartment deal.
That's right. And that's why this, the internal rates of return are so important, because you're waiting, from the date you start construction, you're waiting to stabilization. You can be waiting 3.5, 4 years for that money to start returning money.
It's also crazy going back to the red tape then. Like if the red tape causes the whole process to expand by 12 months, that's another year of zero on the return. Like that drastically affects the IRR.
That it definitely does. And that is also why, particularly given today's day and age, you would think we could use technology and some AI to be able to understand how to get these things processed faster.
Man.
Well, when we talked about Lincoln Yards on here, when we had Matt on here, you remember because the city held him up, it cost him X amount of $1 million more to build that bridge over the river.
Billions.
Because the interest rates went up. That was
there's a bond expiring or something.
Like that's crazy. And it was all just because someone couldn't get shit done.
Well, and it's also, these big projects, they do take some thought and some forethought, and what are the long-term ramifications of them? Having said that, they're typically in the best use of an urban environment to have these big planned communities so that they are live, work, play. I mean, all cities are vibrant if you can do more than one thing within a 12-block radius. You don't want to just go to work and then leave. You don't want to come downtown just to play and then leave. So the more you can do these planned developments, I think the better it is for urban environments. They just take a long time and they're subject to economic cycle risk.
For those of you that like this episode, that was episode 199, where we went over Lincoln Yards with Sterling Bay. So that was a equally interesting conversations today.
Yeah. So Susan, you alluded to just some of the positives in Chicago here. When you're at a networking event, a national one, and they're talking about the crime, they're talking about the taxes, they're talking about our budget. What are some of those responses? You kind of alluded to them earlier, but what are some of those? No, like, I'm actually very happy here. We're breaking ground here because of XYZ.
So my first thing I say is, it's a lazy man's game if all you're going to do is read the headlines. Because if you listen to the headlines, you could not walk down any street in the city of Chicago without fearing for your life. And that's just lazy. What that is an excuse that says I can make money someplace else easier, so I'm not going to bother with Chicago. And that has fallen on some city hall administration's deaf ears, that they didn't believe that people would bypass Chicago if they wanted to be a national developer. But it's lazy to say to just look at headlines. The second thing is that the quality of life for what it costs you in Chicago is not replicable in any other gateway city in this country. And it's not just because of Big Ten, particularly the original Big Ten land grant campuses where those young professionals want to come to the city of Chicago. It's throughout the Midwest. If you want to live in an urban environment and you want to spend 28 to 32% of your income on housing, there isn't another gateway market where you can do that. And I think people, particularly on the coast, underestimate what the upward mobility for your professional life in Chicago looks like. Particularly there's some rarefied air that says, you can't be somebody unless you live in New York and be in the finance world. And that's just a fallacy. That's just not true. And we're seeing Chicago more and more be the center of big, high-powered financing jobs and real estate jobs. Harrison is homegrown. Heitman is homegrown. Walton Street is homegrown. There are a lot of big international institutional companies that were born in Waterton, Larimar. You can survive in Chicago and do more than survive. You can thrive. So that's a fallacy. I think also that is a lazy man's way out. And the final thing I would say is, as we look forward in 5 or 10 years, that big body of water out there is going to be very important. Climate change is real, and having weather patterns that are more predictable and less disruptive, being close to fresh water, being close to the ability to expand in other land is going to be hyper important. And I think Chicago is going to be at the center of that on a national level. I can't speak globally, but certainly on a national level. I mean, how many days of 120 degrees in a row in Phoenix are you going to be willing to put up with? And people complain. They make the statement of like, how many days under 32 degrees was Chicago last year? Consecutive days. Well, I'll take the 8 days. I think that was the record. Maybe it was 12 days of below zero. That year when the polar vortex broke loose, I'll take 8 days of below zero compared to 42 days of over 100 degrees.
Yeah. 100%. Well said. You got me fired up. Like, thank you for, these are all things that I think, but I don't know that much. So I'm like, oh, am I an idiot? No. So I'm glad someone smarter than me is out there preaching.
I don't know that I'm smarter than you, but we're not idiots.
All right. Good enough for me. So, all right, Mark, you ready to wrap?
Ready to wrap. Susan, you ready?
Yes.
All right. What's your competitive advantage? How have you been able to do all of this while others wish they could even do a small part of it?
I will say this with tongue in cheek. Um, Sometimes it's better to be a woman, and let egos play out and quietly get the work done. That's not tongue in cheek. Here's the tongue in cheek. I can swear better than anybody I know.
You've held yourself this show. There's a few times I thought you'd let loose.
Definitely, I can go toe to toe with the best of them.
Love it. All right. What is one piece of advice you would tell someone that has yet to buy their first property in Chicago?
Make sure you have the staying power to double the time it's going to take to get to financing. That means buying the land, underwriting the land, hiring the attorney, hiring the architect. It always takes longer than you think. So make sure you have the staying power, both from a time, talent, and treasure point of view.
Love it. Love it. What do you do for fun, Susan?
I like to kayak very much. In fact, I'm taking a mental health day after yesterday and going kayaking for 5 hours this afternoon. And on a good day, I've been known to spend a lot of time in the kitchen.
All right. We're recording this day after the national election, so that's what she's referencing.
Very good. All right. Give us a good book, podcast, or self-development activity you'd recommend to our listeners.
So I just read The Overstory by Richard Power. He was the Pulitzer Prize winner in 1986. I'm a big reader. I can't believe I've not read that book before. It changed my life. How the earth works and how the trees work and our total disregard for our planet. Well, I've been preached that for a long, long time by my kids, by my nieces and nephews. Now that I have a 4-month-old grandson, I'm starting to really pay attention. It was not only well written, which is a criteria for me, but the story arc and the moral story of it was phenomenal.
All right, cool. I'll check that out. All right. Besides yourself, name a valuable resource you can refer to other Chicago real estate investors.
As a resource, meaning a person?
Could be a person, could be a publication, could be a company.
I need to think about that. Let me get back to you on that. I don't know that. A valuable resource. Go visit other cities. Go see how it's done differently in other places. It's amazing to see. You think that building a building is the same everywhere. Maybe 85% of it is, but the 15% that is not is life-changing.
I'll speak to that. Exploring Milwaukee and Florida made me appreciate Chicago architecture so much more. And I would never have done that if I didn't go look at other cities.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. Awesome. Susan, you provide a ton of value to our listeners. How can they learn more about you? Is there any way they can provide value to you?
Of course. I love to talk with people who are new to commercial real estate, particularly women. Happy to have a coffee and talk about what your goals are. I love walking neighborhoods and looking at new buildings or seeing the vision someone has for what buildings should be and could be, particularly as it relates to affordable housing. Everybody has the right to a place to live that has dignity in it. And I'm a big proponent of that. So, I'm happy. Anybody who's reached out to me and asked for a coffee, I've never said no.
Awesome.
All right. People do actually listen to this show. You might get hit up here.
I'm glad. I'm glad.
So, all right. We end with our Chicago fact. Mark, who we playing for? Who's sponsoring?
All right. Well, today's sponsor, I switched it up because of the reference here, but today's sponsor is Kaiser Group, and we're playing for Jesus Wilcox. Susan, if you or me gets the Chicago fact right, Jesus will get a $50 gift card brought to you by Kaiser Group.
All right.
Excellent.
We're trying to take $50 out of Lee's pocket here. So let's do this.
I love it.
It's multiple choice. So CTA has 8 train lines. We've named them on a previous episode. So different question here. Collectively, between all the different 8 train lines, roughly how many stations are there? And your options are 65, 100, 140, 210. 65, 100, 140, 210.
140.
Yeah.
Mark, what are you thinking? Choose something else. Double the chances here.
I would go on the higher end. So I'll even say 210 just to play case.
140 and confidently. Did you actually know that one? Or is it just confident response?
Yes. Both. It's both. It's both. I did not know that, but that logically makes sense to me given the population and how far the train lines run. So is it
I would have
140?
said 142. My thought was 8
Yeah.
train lines.
Yeah.
They're all about 20
Yeah.
miles and one every mile. Like that was kind of my math I was figuring.
Yep.
Good job, guys.
All right. All
Excellent.
right. Hey, Zeus, you get a $50 gift card brought to you by Kaiser Group. Thank you, Lee.
I could give you Lee's cell phone number if that helps collect.
There you go. Yeah, we need that deadbeat.
That's exactly what he wants us to hand out his cell phone on the show.
That's right. That's right.
It's
I
part
don't know.
of,
Knowing Lee, he might want that.
Lee, it's part of your package. All right. All right. Susan, thanks for coming on here. Tom, thanks for always. Listeners, leave us a review on iTunes because that helps our ranking, our ability to reach more people like you. That's all we ask of you. Go on there and leave us a 5-star review. If you want to leave something humorous, we do read them and we do appreciate them. And definitely helps us help you. So Susan, thank you. Tom, thank you. Listeners,
My pleasure.
see you next week.